Question: what are some practical steps for developing Christ discernment in the critical stages of ascending in consciousness between becoming aware of the existence of fallen beings and having honed one's intuitive faculties to discern between the cleverest of those who are under active manipulation by the fallen beings or fallen beings in embodiment? To summarize, what are effective signals one can possibly identify to help differentiate between complex energies before the higher levels of consciousness are achieved? So, a little bit of a complex formulation of the question, but let me try and simplify it a little bit. Christ discernment, what is that? Well, Christ discernment is based on what I also call the one mind in order to be as universal as possible. So I've said that everything is created out of the one mind. And so the real discernment to make is something based on the one mind or based on the separate mind? As I said, because we have free will, we can go into a state of consciousness of separation, which is an illusion, because everything is still out of the one mind. But nevertheless, we experience it as an illusion, and in that state of illusion, we can create all of these ideas based on a duality consciousness. And this is what some beings have done, which I call fallen beings, which I explained in a video called How the World Was Created, and several other videos in that playlist. So if you're new to this concept, you need to look at that. So basically, there are beings who are trapped in the separate mind, which we could also call the consciousness of Antichrist. And they have created all kinds of illusions, all kinds of lies. They use very, very subtle reasoning called the serpentine logic to make it seem like this is all legit. Some even make it seem like it's spiritual. So if I understand the question correctly, it is, what are some practical steps for developing the ability to discern between that which comes from the consciousness of Antichrist and that which comes from the consciousness of Christ? And the first thing I would say about that is that, well, actually, the very first thing I would say about it is that this is the central enigma, the central challenge of the spiritual path. Because when you go into separation, you lose contact, conscious contact with the Christ mind. And everything you see, everything you have been taught, everything you believe is based on the illusion of Antichrist. And it's tricky because you are immersed in it. It's like I've said before, you put on yellow glasses and you are seeing that the sky is green. So if you had never seen the sky without the glasses, you would think it was green. And this is the situation of most of us when we find the spiritual path. We have probably not consciously seen or experienced the Christ mind. Maybe we have experienced it and we didn't realize what it was. And that's why we are open to the spiritual path, because we, as I said, the conscious you, which is the core of our beings, can step outside of the outer personality, and you can experience something that's beyond your own mind and beyond the level of duality and separation. So basically, if you talk about practical steps, wait. I want to go back, because the first thing is that it's difficult, it's tricky. The second important thing is that it's not a mechanical thing. It is not a mechanical thing. It's not like you can just say, okay, I realize there's this concept of Christ discernment. I want to have that. What are the practical mechanical steps I can take? It doesn't work that way. It's not like building a house. You say, okay, I need to have the plans, I need to get the materials, I need to create the foundation, I need to build the walls, then put the roof on. It's not like that. And so, in terms of practical steps, there isn't a direct practical step you can take. You have to engage in the spiritual path. And the goal of the spiritual path is to gradually take you higher and higher, whereby you increase your discernment. And discernment is not a matter of understanding intellectually. This can be very, very tricky to understand. It took me many, many years to grasp this. Because in our modern societies, we are brought up to think with a rational, linear, intellectual, logical mind, we should be able to understand everything. So, for the first many years I had the concept of Christ discernment. I thought, oh, it's a matter of increasing my understanding. If I understand, for example, that I was brought up with a materialistic teaching that there's nothing beyond the material universe. But if I understand a spiritual teaching that describes that there is a spiritual realm beyond the material universe and what that realm is like, then I will acquire Christ's discernment. But it's not that simple. It helps to understand, yes, but Christ's discernment really is beyond understanding. It's also important to realize that building Christ's discernment is not about being right. This is also very difficult. I struggle with it. I've seen other people struggle with it. You know, again, we are brought up with this linear, logical, intellectual mind, right? And it goes, as I've said before, all the way back to Aristotle, Greek philosopher 2,500 years ago, who came up with this system of logic. A statement is either true or false. There's nothing in between. It's the principle of the excluded middle. And this means that we have been brought up from a religious side. Our religion is the only true religion. All others are of the devil. Or scientific materialism is true because science proves that this is just the way it is. And so we think when we hear the concept of Christ's discernment, it's a matter of understanding a spiritual teaching so we know what's absolutely true and then anything else is false. And I have seen spiritual people who use this to actually get themselves to think, I have Christ's discernment, and that is why I know that this particular viewpoint is true and the opposite is false. I'm not going to mention any here because it always gets people into, oh, you agree or disagree. So a particular viewpoint is true, the opposite is false. And so really what this process does is it gives your ego a way to say, because you have Christ's discernment and you know this is true, you never have to question this again. And then you have put yourself in a nice little mental box and you think you have Christ's discernment, but you don't. And this is, to talk about fallen beings who want to deceive us, this is exactly what the fallen beings want you. There is nothing better for them than getting you to think you have Christ's discernment, but you actually don't. You are trapped in one of their illusions. And you can't question it because you think it's the absolute truth. So, you can come to this point as the question kind of describes, that you have raised your consciousness. You become aware of the existence of the fallen beings. You have sharpened your intuitive abilities. But how do you make a distinction between the most cleverest, the most subtle, the most deceptive of the fallen beings? And you cannot do it based on these outer viewpoints by just saying, oh, this person is saying what I believe is true, so therefore this is not a fallen being that's out to deceive me. It's not that simple. This is very close to what I have called black and white thinking in some of the ego discourses. So it goes back to what I said. What is the Christ mind. It's the one mind. It's meant to ensure oneness. Oneness between you and ultimately your Creator, but more immediately, oneness between you, the conscious you, and the higher self, and your ascended teachers. But also a horizontal oneness between you and other people. So, you can have this, and I've seen this in spiritual movements, especially in my second spiritual movement. You can have this culture where people think they have acquired some Christ discernment, but they are still trapped in this wanting to be right, or wanting to be special, or wanting to be superior compared to others. And so there are people who are trying to use this, their idea that they have Christ discernment, to build themselves up as being special by making other people wrong. And this is not Christ discernment. Because what is Christ discernment? It is that you, the conscious you see beyond the outer mind. And it's only the outer mind that has these human opinions, political opinions, religious opinions, whatever you have. It's only the outer mind that has these opinions and that is so attached to it because there's a separate self. The entire existence of that separate self is based on this particular viewpoint. Christianity is the only true religion. Communism is the only true political system. The entire existence of the separate self is based on this. And it's not willing to give it up. So this is what makes people very attached to these outer opinions. And quite frankly, if you are attached to a particular opinion on earth, you don't have Christ discernment. Because when you have Christ discernment at the personal level or at the vertical level, the conscious you realizes your pure awareness. You are not any of this outer personality. You are an extension of your I Am Presence. And your I Am Presence is beyond these human opinions. I mean, the I Am Presence and the Ascended Masters are just looking down neutrally on earth. They're not taking any sides. They're not saying this is right, this is wrong. They just see that this is all part of the play on earth. I'm not saying there aren't viewpoints, this is the tricky part, that are more valid than others. But if you understand what I'm saying, if you grasp what I'm saying, you are seeing that you are more than the outer viewpoints. There's more to you than the outer viewpoints. So this now means that when you're dealing with other people, if you recognize the Christ in you, you will also, at a certain point, come to recognize the Christ in others. And what does the Christ mind want? It wants to raise up all life, to have them, all beings, come back to oneness. And therefore the Christ mind is not putting other people down, it's not seeking to make them wrong. It's not caught up in this value judgment of the dualistic mind. This is what the fallen beings want to do. They want to make themselves superior, and in order to do this, when you are in separation, you can only do it by putting other people down. That is not the Christ mind. So this is tricky, I understand. Because what does that mean then? Does that mean you can't ever express an opinion or an observation and say, oh, this just isn't right, this is a lie, this is an illusion? I've had people ask me that question. And of course you can. You see, Jesus, he challenged the scribes and the Pharisees. He was often very challenging with his old disciples, like when he said to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan." But it's not done from the separate self's desire to raise yourself up by putting others down. It's done from a desire to awaken people from their illusions so that they can all be raised up. And I know it's a subtle difference. You cannot grasp it with the outer mind, with the intellectual linear mind, because what the linear mind wants to say is, it wants to say, okay, give me a rule then. So tell me, what was the rule that Jesus applied, whether he challenged people or was nice to them? But there is no rule. The Christ mind looks at situation to situation and says, here's a person who is in this state of consciousness. What can help that person come closer to oneness? And sometimes it may be to challenge an illusion, be very direct because the person isn't open to seeing it. Other times it may be very loving and to be loving and kind. There is no linear rule that's always the same. And this is again what confuses many people, because they think that if the Christ mind is the one mind, it should always be the same. But you see, the Christ mind is always the same. It's always challenging the illusion that takes you away from oneness. But the illusions we have on earth are so many, so different, so completely opposites. And that's why there can't be a hard and fast rule. That this is what the Christ always does. So I have in a number of videos talked about the need to become neutral. In order to be open to your higher self, to having good intuition, to receiving directions from the Ascended Masters, you have to be as neutral as possible. So if you want a practical guideline, strive to be as neutral as possible. Realize that if you have a strong opinion, you have this obsessive compulsive desire to prove that opinion right, or an obsessive compulsive desire to be right, this comes from separate selves. It doesn't come from the Christ mind, it can't. So you then have to look at your psychology. And that's why I would say, practical steps for increasing Christ discernment. Well, first of all, use the tools to invoke light from the Masters. So you get protected from these influences, from the serpentine mind. You get cut free from any ties you have to them. And you experience there's a higher level of energy. Because when you are invoking light from the Ascended Masters or listening to a dictation from the Ascended Master, you're really experiencing that there's a higher level of energy. And it helps you build this discernment where you can discern the energy level. And really, when you're talking about fallen beings, they're very good at putting on a facade, putting on an appearance. And sometimes they can be so clever at coming up with arguments that it's very difficult at the level of the arguments to see that this comes from the mind of Antichrist. But if you have that intuitive contact with the mind of Christ, you can sense that the vibration is off, the vibration is lower. And that's really ultimately the only way to tell the difference. And I know this is, some people will say, gosh, what is he talking about? Because I have experienced over the years that most people actually have the ability to read vibration, to read energy. Most spiritual people. That's why we're spiritual. But I have experienced there are some people on the spiritual path who haven't developed that ability. And that's why they always want to have a rule. But if you haven't developed it, you haven't developed it, but you can. So then you need to focus on that. And that very much has, again, to do with just being neutral. Because I see the people, there's a very clear correlation. People who have Christ discernment are not attached to outer beliefs, and they are not attached to being right all the time. But people who are attached, they can't read energy. Because why? Because they are focused on the outer opinions. And they're thinking in binary terms, right and wrong. But see, in the Christ mind, there's no right or wrong. Because right or wrong is a dualistic evaluation based on separation. In the Christ mind, there's only oneness and that which is apart from oneness. And, having a particular political or religious viewpoint on earth is not going to take you closer to oneness, especially not if you use it to feel that you're right and other people are wrong. If you're superior to other people, how can you come closer to oneness? In oneness, there's no superiority. There's no right or wrong, no good people or bad people. So, practical steps, the whole spiritual path is about this. But first of all, this becoming neutral and looking for these separate selves that are so attached to specific opinions, attached to being right and wrong, attached to being superior to others, and thinking that this can be defined in black and white terms, whether you're right or wrong. Oh, it's just not that simple. And the higher you go, the more sensitive you become. There are, of course, as you also increase your discernment, you become better at reading the vibration. And therefore you can sometimes see that somebody's saying something and you can't really argue against it at the level of words, but the vibration just isn't there. It's not a higher vibration. And of course, how are you going to explain that to people? You have a person who's saying something with words. You can't, at the level of words, with a linear, logical mind, say why it's wrong, but you just sense the vibration is wrong. But how are you going to translate that into words? No. So it's not easy to do, and I'm not saying it's easy, but certainly you can come to that point where, for yourself, you can read that vibration and you can sense. And just look at a person sometimes, and you just get from your higher self, that's a fallen being. And it's not that you then judge them or condemn them or put them down, but you just realize that no matter what they're saying, there's something missing there. And sometimes you can also get the Christ perspective and see what's missing, because they are, for example, trying to prove other people wrong, or they're trying to prove themselves superior. And being only focused on themselves. But so I think that's as far as I can go with something practical. Walk the path and strive to be neutral.